we were working on the Buddhist understanding of reality, which is what the Buddha's Dhamma, the Buddha's actual teaching, is about. And we were dealing with the knotty problem of anatta, which means not self, the awkward translation. But it's the best way to put it. And sometimes people translate anatta as no self, which is permissible up to a point, providing you make it clear. That doesn't mean that there's nothing at all. A human being then becomes rather like a robot. I mean, there is something, to use a word, that you could call selfish about a human being, obviously. But it becomes too great with us. That seems to be the problem the Buddha was pointing to. There is a survival instinct involved here. And as mentioned yesterday, it seems it's given our abilities to feel, think, and perceive on rather advanced levels, it's easy for us to misunderstand this feeling and call it me, which we do regularly. Everybody does. I mentioned also that there is some understanding of how the problem originates. Now, Buddhists say that what is here is anatta. There's no abiding self principle involved in the process of being alive. But there is a feeling of being me which does arise into the mind. The feeling of being me, myself, I am. But it's something that comes and goes. It's not a permanent part of us. It's not even a reality. It's just a feeling. And it's always arises in the same way and for the same reason. Now, Buddhists point out that seeking delight, seeking stimulation, involves a kind of desire which is dangerous. This kind of desire is what tends to cause a feeling that it's me who's desiring, if you like, who's then going to go about getting what I desire or not getting what I desire. In other words, there'll be a me then living life. But it's what they call ephemeral. It comes and it goes. It's a feeling that depends on certain kinds of experiences. Buddhadasa, God bless him, was very generous about this. And he thought it only happened to human beings occasionally during the course of a day. The number of times the ego sense arose and dominated our lives would only happen a few times during the course of a day. The older John lived most of his life in monasteries and went to India once, never went to the West at all, certainly never came here. So I think he didn't quite understand the pressures of living in a Western society where advertising is constantly pushing you in a certain direction. So it's not just a question of waiting for stimulating events to occur in our lives and then getting involved with them and then creating a feeling of self in our minds in dependence on that kind of experience. It's something we seek. It becomes a very strong habit. We want to be happy like all things do, but our happiness, unfortunately, we prefer if it's mixed up with stimulation and excitement. So we tend to seek the kind of experiences that do that. Now, according to Buddhists, an excited mind state is an abnormal mind state. And when we deliberately create mental disturbance of that kind, deliberately excite the mind, and the result of that is something else which is abnormal, you might say, or artificial, and that's the feeling of me. We mentioned the baby, the little child, being fed by its mother or being treated as the way children are when they're very small. You bathe a little blighter, talk to it all the time you're doing it, poking its little belly, trying to get it to smile because it makes you feel good when it does that. You dress it up, powder its little bum, dress it up, nice and clean, then you feed it. All the time it's an interaction between mother and child, which is really, I suppose, impossible not to indulge in. Children being so, well, appealing and helpless, depend on us entirely. But by actually doing that, by giving the child more than you need to give it, And we all do this. Anybody who brings a child into the world will do it. You're kind of teaching that infant to be delighted, whether it would ever find out for itself, whether it could discover delight and excitement in sense experience if it was left alone, is debatable. The child is introduced to the possibility of delight, and once it is delighted, once you, for instance, make a fuss of it while you're feeding and clothing and bathing and all the rest, the little infant, then it's going to seek that kind of experience in future. Yes, it wants to be fed, it will feel hunger, but it will also desire to be stimulated, to be petted, to be talked to be made a fuss of. Sounds so innocent. It's almost a shame to mention it, but it is the origin of self-belief, because that kind of experience will cause the child to desire to increase and prolong the experience. And that desire will be what Buddhists call Taṇhā. Taṇhā is always based in ignorance, and so the feeling of being me will invade that child's consciousness in a childish way, of course, and because of that it will experience life from a self-centered point of view. It will be me that's experiencing life, and so it will have some degree of dukkha. Now, babies don't have much, but they have it, of course. So those kind of experiences, like when we grow up, we continue on in the same way. We're always seeking certain kinds of experiences. That's why big sporting events, the more exciting they are, the greater the attendance. And excitement comes from different sources. Famous people competing against each other on a sporting field is quite an interesting thing to watch, of course, very stimulating. Games, professional sports of any kind, very popular in this world. The reason cinema has been so popular is the same. When I was younger, television was quite the thing. I don't know how much of a hold it has on people's minds now. It's rather been superseded by the internet, because of course all television channels can be channeled through the internet, through an internet connection. Still popular, of course. Drinking the various beverages we don't need. I just had a cup of coffee. It's hardly delicious, I don't drink it for that. Kind of wakes me up a bit, makes me a bit more alert. That's not a great crime for a monk, although it's better done with Japanese tea than coffee. But the coffee here is very good, especially the black version. And where I live, such things never come my way, or very rarely. So the child will be introduced to delight, to the discover delight in its life. And it will quickly develop a habit towards that. So let's say it's being fed and petted and messed around in the way Mama does, and it thoroughly enjoys that little blighter. Then when that's all finished, because it's a little baby, it's not going to stay conscious for too long. They need to rest, they need to sleep a lot. The little bodies grow and develop, and strength increase. So as soon as it falls asleep, as soon as it gets tired of being fed and all the rest, it will get sleepy. And in no long time, we can put it in its cot, on its side, a little counterpane over it, and off it will go into dreamland. When it does that, its mind will be completely clear of any feeling of being me. It's ephemeral, it comes, it goes, and when it goes completely. There is no connection between these occasions when the self-sense arises into the human mind at all. They're not real in the ultimate sense, but it's a definite feeling of self that invades the mind. But it's always in response to these kind of experiences, which is why the Buddhists, and any major religion, I suppose, points out that you should behave in a certain way. Refrain from things that stimulate the mind unnecessarily. Generally, we tend to live for those kind of things because they're what make life tolerable for most of us. Unfortunate. So that baby will go to sleep and its mind will go back to being the original mind, as the Zen people would say. Its mind will be free of any problem. Well, sort of. The self-sense will disappear, and then the next time it gets involved in a similar kind of experience, a stimulating experience, it will create another feeling of self-independence on this other experience. But they won't be connected, and it won't be the same self. And this is the crux of the matter. There is no abiding self. We just believe there is because we don't know any better. But if you're willing to investigate, you can actually observe the process. If you know how it feels when the mind is dominated by an ego sense, how different that is to the times when you restrain the way you live and the mind more or less dispenses with the feeling of selfishness. You can't actually destroy it by just controlling your life. It requires insight. But you can control it. Your life can become very different once you know how to do that. But the baby doesn't know that, so keeps on indulging, looks forward to being petted and made a fuss of by its mother. And every time it does, a sense of self will dominate its mind for a certain time. And then when it's no longer interested or falls asleep again, that self-sense will be completely gone. But something else won't be gone. Something will be left behind. Now we're using language which is by no means acceptable in an ultimate sense when we describe the mind in this way. We talk about something remaining behind in the mind, because the mind doesn't exist outside of sense experience. We're going to talk about a subconscious, which is never acknowledged in Buddhism, but it makes it easier to explain what we're about to explain. When the baby falls asleep, the self-sense will be gone. But from the first time it creates a feeling of me, then when that baby falls asleep and that self-sense disappears along with the mind that created it, there'll be something left behind in the subconscious. And that's the beginning of what they call the root defilements in Buddhism. We mentioned them already. Greed is one of them, or lust, and that is what comes from the child desiring to be stimulated. It's a form of lust or greed for stimulation. That leaves the root defilement, the akusala mula, behind in the subconscious. A little mark appears on that child's subconscious mind. Because it has a little mark called greed, it's also going to have a little mark called aversion or hatred, which is a rather strong word to use. Aversion is better. And when you have greed to get something, there is always the corresponding, the opposite, aversion to avoid something. The two go together, like the two sides of a coin, the heads and the tails on a coin. And so the little infant will begin building up the root defilement of aversion. And, of course, the soil those two grow in, what allows those things to arise is the basic root defilement of delusion, which will be the first thing to arise. The fact that that child's made a feeling of me in its mind is enough to cause a root defilement of what they call moha, delusion, to begin growing up in the child's subconscious. And every time the child indulges in the desire for stimulation, these three monsters will increase in strength. And as mama, papa, and school teachers, society generally, people generally don't know anything about this. They have no inkling that this is happening. They go on indulging in the same way, because what those defilements do is they continually influence the way we respond to life. And not just that, the way we understand life also. They tend to distort the way we understand things. The things we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, even think and imagine, acquire meanings they don't actually have. The defilements are capable of doing that. This is why we live in a world of goods and bads, basically. We judge things as good or bad because of the defilements. They kind of enhance our experiences, make them more interesting, more stimulating, add color to them. It's not really there. Hence the insight into the true nature of things, into the fact that everything is really just what it is in nature. Nature doesn't have any meanings any more than a human being has any particular meaning, but not in the world we inhabit. We see meanings in everything, values, if you like. That's why gold and silver have meaning for us. These are just metals that occur naturally in the earth. Diamonds, produced by great pressure deep in the earth. Animals aren't interested in things they can't eat, so you could give an animal all the gold in the world, it would take no notice of it. Well, it might pee on it, but it wouldn't do anything else. This is what the defilements do. They turn our world into a kind of wonderland. Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights is born in this way. And then they drive us in a certain direction. So the stronger they are, the more bound we'll be to a certain kind of life. And that will be the lifestyle that keeps us seeking the stimulating, trying to avoid anything that's not stimulating. Every time we indulge, we increase the power of the defilements. And so they become very powerful things. And when you try to turn your life around, of course, it's very difficult because you're trying to go against the flow of the defilements. And talking about defilements as if they were different from us, but they aren't. They basically are us. The feeling of self is essentially a manifestation of these things called root defilements on the conscious level. No more than that. So you're continually increasing the defilements, you're continually increasing the strength of the illusion of being me. But remember, it's always coming and going. It's never a permanent thing, so it can be destroyed, it can be stopped. If it was a permanent thing, you couldn't do anything about it. Now, it comes from foolish desire. So let's carry on with the story. The baby grows into a little child and begins to move around. All the time it's experiencing. At first its experiences aren't so many of the kind that could create this response we've mentioned. So it doesn't create the feeling of me too often during the course of a day, while it's still lying in a cot or in its pushchair, and it has to be constantly attended to. The baby won't have too many stimulating experiences, so it won't create too many feelings of being me during the course of one 24-hour period. So the roots won't grow too quickly, the defilements won't expand that quickly. But once it starts to move around a little bit, once it starts to crawl, and little babies do this quite quickly, then it can explore, it can get into all kinds of situations, and babies tend to. They're very adventurous, they want to look around, the world's a brand new place to them. They've been introduced to the possibility of delight, so they go looking around for it, poking their nose into all sorts of places. So its experiences will increase, and as its experiences, ability to experience increases, so the root defilements will grow correspondingly, because it will create more and more feelings of being me, in dependence on the things that it finds which are capable of doing that. Until it starts to walk, and then it can really move around. And so it goes on, until the time comes when the feeling of self, of being me, just becomes a part of its life. It happens so often to the child, it just becomes a belief. This is me. It just accepts it. Perhaps belief is not quite the right word. It's a tacit acceptance that this is me. But until that moment arises, the child there'll be times in its life, lots of times, when it's not being dominated by a feeling of being me. But there will come a point when that becomes what it is. It will just, this is me. End of story. The Buddha describes this in a text from what they call the middle-length sayings. This is the Pali title is Majjhima Nikaya. Nikaya is a section of the Buddhist scriptures. Not all of which come from the Buddha. Quite a lot come from his disciples, wise people like himself. But this particular one does come from the Buddha. It's called the Maha Taṇhā Saṅkhaya Sutta. Sutta or sutra means thread. It's a discourse. Quite long, deals with lots of things, most of them very boring. And there are actually two parts to it. I think it's in the second part, one small paragraph, where the Buddha talks about the point in the life of a young child when it actually is beset by the problem of dukkha. That is, dukkha becomes a part of its life, which it always has from that time on until the time it dies, unless it does something about it. He says playing with toys. It's a time when children play with toys. Well, they play with toys very quickly, very early in life. And so that point, says he, that the dukkha will become part of that child's life because the feeling of me will just be accepted by it as being what it is. Playing with toys, children play with toys very early. Everything you give a child is basically a toy, really, from what? A few months into its life. So that's how the problem arises and develops. And of course we continue on doing the same things. We never really stop. Into our adult life as children we seek the stimulating. It doesn't have to be a positive experience to create a feeling of me in a child's mind, even negative experience as well. It experiences something unpleasant. This will also cause desire of a foolish kind. This will be desire, but not to get, but to destroy, to get rid of, to get away from. Even that will cause a feeling of self to arise. One kind will be positive, one negative, but there'll still be ego senses, and they will increase the root defilements in the same way. The Buddha only mentions positive experiences, stimulating experiences, because the unpleasant, well, that's obvious, that's quite easy to deal with. Nobody wants to experience unpleasant things, so we're always trying to get away from those. But it's the pleasant things that we seek because we don't know how dangerous these are, in a Buddhist sense, because these are the ones that are dangerous, because we don't realize the sting in the tail of seeking out, stimulating and exciting. We don't realize that it actually brings us problems, because it's what's always recreating and in the end supporting the illusion that there is a me living life. And if there's a me living life, then everything is happening to me. So we have then mental disturbance of the various kinds: anxiety, fear, doubt, boredom. It's very common. Stemming from fear, stemming from loneliness, things of that nature is another problem. Boredom, yes, indeed. As well as pain is happening to us, this causes immense mental disturbance. But even discomfort is something we can't tolerate. We have a lot of mental problems because we have self-belief. We just accept there is a me living life, and this is how the Buddhists look at its origins. Well, if the Buddhists say what they say is true, and that what's really here is void of anything you could call an abiding me, it's just an illusion. Okay, it comes and it goes, but in effect it really is not an essential part of life. It's not something we're born with. At first a baby is a blank sheet, it doesn't have this problem. If this is true and there's no me living life, then what is living it? You might ask the question. And people generally do. Well, it's not the body that's living it, because that's just a physical lump of matter, although it is conscious. Consciousness associated with the body, there is. So the body is capable of surviving without the mind, at least to some degree. But it's the mind that lives life, because this is the boss of things. The Taṇhā, as they say in Thailand. The leader. The body just does what it's told. And when you hear anything, for instance, there's a sequence of events which can be traced and analyzed without mentioning anything called a self. The Buddhists and the Hindus, prior to the Buddhists, understood life in the same way, the basic nature of a human being, or any living creature really, as being composed of really 5 basic elements, which they refer to as aggregates. The Pali word is Khandha. Khandha. It means aggregate. And sometimes the word heap is used, like a pile of things. But that's not too wise, because when you call an aggregate a heap, it tends to sound like something. But the aggregates are not things. The one that comes closest to being something is what they refer to as the Rupa Khandha. A Rupa Khandha is the body. But because of the way we experience, it's also anything physical or material outside of us. So the entire material world, including the physical part of us, is included in what the Buddhists refer to as a Rupa Khandha. Rupa means form. Khandha is aggregate, and what that means is that it's an aggregate of things. Like the body is not one solid piece of matter. Well, it's not matter at all, ultimately, but keeping it simple. There are many parts in the body, and millions of cells, so it's an aggregate of different things, and mixing together a kind of conglomerate of things, not just one solid lump. The physical organism, the Rupa Khandha, has the sense functions, or sense doors as the Buddhists call them, because they kind of open to let information into the mind. Arranged on its surface, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body surface itself is sensitive, and these are called the inner sense doors. The Pali word is ayatana. Ayatana. These are the dynamic part of the Rupa Khandha. There's also the sight, sounds, smells, tastes, touches that are available in the world around us, which can meet with the inner senses. All this is the Rupa Khandha. There's no me involved in that, say the Buddhists. It's just what it is. It's just nature. It's just materiality, physicality. It's not anything, and science can tell you what the physical body is. It's vibrating atoms, keeping it simple. If you move into the mental part of things, then there are three other aggregates we can talk about. One of them is called Vedana Khandha. It's the aggregate of feeling. Human beings experience everything through the aegis of feeling. When you see anything, like a beautiful sunset or a beautiful whatever, or a really beautiful big red Ferrari roaring off down the road, and you think, oh, look at that. It's not the beautiful sunset or the beautiful big red Ferrari that's making you do that. It's the feeling that your mind develops in response to it. The feelings are what we respond to all the time. They're basically pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. There's those three categories. This is Vedana Khandha. Again, they're not anything. These are electrical discharges at best, flashes of lightning occurring in the mind whenever there's a sense experience. There's the aggregate of perception, which is called Sanya Khandha. Sanya is the recognizer, the discriminator. I know that's black, and I know the floor is a different color because I can recognize that. I know the different colors. I've been taught meanings that this is one color, that's another color, and they're different, so my mind can discriminate the two. I know that's a camera, I know this is a floor because I know these things. I have these stored in my memory. And so the Sanya Khandha, the process of perception, relies a lot on memory. It uses memory, although memory is not part of it. Sanya is like a scanner. The more you look at something, the more information you pick up from it. This is how we know men, women, beautiful, ugly, green, white, long, short, high, low, everything in the world, trees, sky, rats, crocodiles. This is how we know all these things, because we store this information in our memory. And when we see such a thing, then the scanner of perception does its work and recognizes. It's like it goes somewhere, picks the appropriate information and comes back and presents it to the aggregate of consciousness, but we get ahead of ourselves a little bit. Sanya is the most important of the aggregates. They never refer to it as mental, by the way. Always non-physical is the term used in Buddhism, which is kind of weird. Maybe they just don't have a word in the ancient Pali language that means mental. Not important, anyway. The final aggregate, or the final one that is active, that does anything obvious, is the Sankhara Khandha, the aggregate of thinking. This is thinking that we do all the time, active thinking, deliberated thinking included. The process of thinking. And like the Sanya Khandha, like the Vedana Khandha, like the Rupa Khandha, there is nobody involved in these functions. It's just the functions themselves. They operate in dependence on being stimulated, and sense experience is what does that. The thinking process, whenever you think anything really, is basically the aggregate of thinking that's doing it. And we're always thinking because we have to think to do or to speak. You can't make any activity unless you think it first. You can't speak unless the, mind forms the sounds first, and then the organ of speech can do what it's told and speak words, make some statement. And on top of all this, there is something called vijnana, which is the aggregate of consciousness. Again, not anything. A flash, again, flashes of lightning, basically electrical discharges, I suppose, at best, is what consciousness it really is. If you can get close to experiencing it, and though it sounds impossible, consciousness can certainly know itself, because the mind or consciousness is a reflective process. It reflects. It's a reflex activity. So it's always a little bit behind. When you experience anything, consciousness is always a little bit behind the experience, because it's what knows the experience. So the experience happens and then consciousness knows it. And so it can be aware of itself also. It can be self-aware. Consciousness is like packets of energy once you get close to the reality of it. It isn't a stream of consciousness. It's not even connected. It's like frames in a movie, but there's no physical connection between them. One moment of consciousness will influence the next moment of consciousness, but that's the only connection. They're not physically connected. Anicca, everything is impermanent, but on very subtle levels. There are no permanent things. Matter is an illusion, even on the mental level this is true. This is how a human being works. So when you hear anything, the ear receives a sound, but nobody is involved in that. It's just the organ doing what it's designed to do. There's a sound, a vibration comes in, vibrates the eardrum. When that happens, consciousness immediately is there, but it's a kind of consciousness called ear consciousness, a specific function. Not eye consciousness, nose, tongue, or body, or mind consciousness, but ear consciousness. There are 6 kinds of consciousness then, not just one. Now this consciousness doesn't know what the sound is, it just knows that something's happening at the ear hole. What happens then is a feeling immediately occurs because there's a disturbance. The mind then responds by creating a feeling. The feeling will be neutral to begin with until perception has done its work. So the feeling will give rise to perception. Even though the feeling is neutral, it has no real meaning, it will wake up perception. Perception will then function. Now nobody feels, it's just the Vedana Khandha doing what it's designed to do. There's been a sense experience, there's been hearing, the ears received a sound, consciousness has become aware of that, and so feeling has arisen. Pleasant, unpleasant, in the beginning neutral. And that gives rise to sanya perception. Perception recognizes what's being heard. Ah, it's Bach. It's the English suite, yes, and Giza King's playing the harpsichord again. Oh, there's the same wrong note he always plays. You'll hear, perception will do this. It will give you all sorts of information. And if you sit and listen to a piece of music, this is what will happen. All the memories of it, all the knowledge you have of it, will come flooding into your mind. This is what perception does. It's like scanning all the time, flickering backwards and forwards at incredible speed. This is in response to a feeling. If a feeling doesn't happen, there'll be no perception. And what we perceive, we think about. I don't like. Oh, that's a wrong note. Oh no, that's out of tune. Thinking, deliberate thinking. Sankhara Khandha operating. Nobody doing it, just the aggregate arising to perform its function. And it's arising because the Sanya Khandha arose before it. So it's a process of cause and effect, cause and condition. First there's a sense experience, then there's consciousness of it. There's no sense experience, there's no consciousness, there's no mind therefore. Consciousness has to arise if the mind is to arise. Once consciousness has arisen, then there will be a feeling. The Vedana Khandha will function, but if there's no consciousness arising, there will be no feeling. Once feeling's arisen, there will be perceiving. If there's no feeling, there'll be no perceiving. And once perceiving's occurred, then the process of thinking will take place and the body will respond in some way. You may speak. If you're listening to music, you may be humming it. But it won't be you. It will be the aggregates doing it. These they say, cling to. This false sense of self is a matter of clinging. The mind clinging to itself as being me. And what it's clinging to is the aggregates. Usually the mental part of life is what's clung to. So whatever we do, it won't be us, it will be the aggregates doing it. You're sitting, meditating, it's the aggregates doing it. Trying to observe your breathing. It's a physical activity. The breath creates a feeling as it enters the nose. This is a sense contact. Breath on the surface of the body. Consciousness is there immediately. This is how you know, you can feel, you're aware that something is happening here. The feeling will arise, it will be a neutral feeling to begin with, mostly neutral. It'll be slightly pleasant depending on your success as a meditator, I suppose. Sanya Khandha will make sense of what's happening. This is breathing, this is how the feeling of breath. The breath is going over the top of my mouth, down my throat, and then you become aware of the movement of the body, because Sanya will scan the process and will continue to do it. And then the thinking process will be involved. That's what will keep your mind on the breathing. But that will depend on Sanya, scanning. Otherwise, thinking can't operate. You won't be able to even attempt meditating. And then consciousness will be aware of all that. Every segment of experience, feeling, perception, thought, all this is accompanied by flashing moments of consciousness. The knower. But what gives consciousness its knowledge kind of presents itself, presents information to consciousness is basically perception. Perception is the most important part. It's the bit that goes most grievously wrong. This is what lives life. There's no me living it. So now we get into some contentious areas. Because where I live, people, nearly everybody, believes they'll be reborn, of course, reincarnated. They don't use that term in Buddhism. Well, there is a Thai phrase for it. I can't remember what it is now. Usually they say Gert Mai, which means born again, or born new. Mai has the meaning of new, but the way Thais use their language, everything is very ambiguous. The words have all sorts of meanings, most of which you'd never suspect. And they say Gert Mai, and this is a great belief. Now, I'm a Buddhist monk, so I take my alms bowl, which is about that big, it's made of stainless steel, sling it. I put it in a bag because I walk a long way. You don't want to carry it in your hand with hot food in it. That can be unpleasant. It's nice to eat, but not nice to get burnt by. So I stick it in a bag and I lash it around my neck. I have a kind of shoulder thing. And off I mince down the road to collect food. Barefoot, of course. This is a tradition. Go stand somewhere, somebody gives me food. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, maybe 15 more years. More or less going to the same places. It's very ritualized. But people are very generous and they give me food. They give me many other things. And I got to know the people who give me food, because it's more or less always the same people. I go to the same places every day. Now, they don't do that because they like me. They probably don't dislike me. In fact, quite a few of them probably do like me. I certainly like them. Thais are very pleasant people. Country Thais, very old-fashioned, very polite, very mannered. Do anything to avoid any kind of problem at all. So it's all very pleasant, lots of smiles, lots of laughter, lots of chatter. But they're basically giving me food as they would give any monk food. And as they present things, they tawai, as they say in Thailand, to the pras, to the monks, to the monasteries. They're not doing that for any other reason than to ensure that the next life will be better than this life. Now, this is the way it is. They had the great man teaching them for 60 years, but it didn't make a lot of difference. People believe what they want, and they're very hard to shift. Now, if the information suddenly became real for them, well, there is no such thing as rebirth. I'm not saying that, mind you. But if that suddenly became knowledge that this is nonsense, then probably I wouldn't be worth a cent. I have a real problem staying alive. Although some would still go on supporting me because they recognize by the way I function and behave that this guy practices something, so maybe it's worth supporting him anyway. But that's why they do it, because they believe they'll be reborn. Now the Buddha teaches anatta and anicca. Never mind dukkha. Everything is anicca. It changes and transforms continually. There's no core or essence to anything, whether it's living or otherwise. Just vibrating atoms, ultimately, on the physical side. Much the same on the mental side. We just mentioned the aggregates. This is a very basic Buddhist teaching. It spells out that what's living life is not you. The aggregates are perfectly capable of living life. They don't need any interference from me. Of course, when you add a sixth component to the 5 aggregates, everything gets complicated, starts to go wrong. Like putting something into a machine which otherwise would run smoothly. And anatta, this is the basis of the Buddha's teaching, that what is here is not me. Thais have been presented with this information since time immemorial, but God bless them, they got wonderful ability to ignore things they don't want to know about. And so the belief is basically a Brahmin belief, because the religion in Thailand was Brahmanism at one time. And the actual change came sometime during the reign of Ashoka or some character of that kind. So a long time ago, when people actually came from Sri Lanka, I think, brought the religion from Sri Lanka originally. And apparently, historically, had a terribly difficult time getting Thais to attach to it, which they eventually did. They accepted Buddhism, but sort of. Buddhadasa made a big point of this, that it's really a mixture of more than one thing, mostly superstition, superstitious belief. Smattering of Brahmanism. A lot of Thai women, particularly the ones who give me food, they always have an image, but it's never the Buddha. Sometimes it's Ganesh even, but usually it's a lady going like this. Because I go to salty egg shops, and this lady is the equivalent of the Hindu Lakshmi, the Hindu goddess Lakshmi, is the goddess of luck. And she's always got lots of garlands round her, and a bottle of Coca-Cola, and something else. She doesn't drink it, she takes the essence of it, that's the idea. And she's going like this. And now they've got another one which is mechanical and actually goes like this. But only the richer ones have that version up to now. This is Thai Buddhism. I love it personally, I think it's wonderful. Unfortunately, you never ask me what I think about it to explain my belief system. Otherwise, I have to tell them what I know. And they've heard it already from Buddhadasa and just chosen, well, he comes from Pungrian, so he doesn't know everything. The point is, anyway, rebirth is traceable. The origins of the theory of rebirth or reincarnation is actually traceable. It's not like it's always been part of human knowledge. And you can actually go back, well, admittedly quite a long time, into pre-Buddhist times. And it seems to arise maybe 100 years before the Buddha was actually born, before Gautama was born into the world, which would put it about 2,600 years ago, maybe 2,700. Because it's not easy to date these things, because we move away from the Pali language into Sanskrit circles. My information comes from an English professor of Sanskrit called Arthur Llewellyn Basham. Great name, Basham. He was a very fine concert pianist, incidentally, besides being a Sanskritist. He spent a lot of his life in India, and like me, felt much enamored of that country. A lot of us are when we go there. I certainly was and am. Married an Indian lady, produced a family, lived most of his life in India. Finished his time, curiously, in Canberra in Australia, of all the places to end up. That's probably the least likable of them. Didn't surprise me, because he was rather outspoken about certain things. He was not one to just accept conventional understandings of anything, like Buddhadasa. It got the old man into trouble, and it got Mr. Basham into trouble too, apparently. That's why he finished up in Canberra in Australia, instead of somewhere more elevated. The man was obviously elevated, and I think a very similar character to Buddhadasa, with a very similar mind, very similar level of intelligence. But he pored over the ancient texts, the ancient Vedic texts, to see if he could discover the origins of rebirth, but didn't really find anything. Now this man he knew the Vedic texts intimately anyway, but he checked everything again. He could read the language. Nothing. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedas, goes back a long time. Recension, the time it was first written down, is about 1,000 years before Christ. So that was when it was actually written down. It's a collection of legends and things. The Tartha Veda, which follows it, is mainly magic spells. And some of them are very strange, love potions and this kind of business. The next one is mostly poetry, incantations and poetry. There's really nothing of an esoteric nature in there, nothing that deals with things like life after death or the reality or otherwise of gods and demons, other realms of existence. This does not seem to have been part of the ancient Vedic religion at all. And the ancient Vedic religion was the religion of the Brahmins. And it seems that this kind of religion was mainly about sacrifice, how to do the sacrifices. If you ever read the Old Testament of the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy, the second book, you'll find similar things about how to set up the tabernacle, how the altar should be designed, how big it should be, how the horns should be manufactured, all sorts of stuff like that. And it seems the Vedas are not so different. There might be some connection between the two, obviously. It wasn't until he went beyond the Vedas or came nearer to modern times and began to look at the set of texts that the Hindus call Upanishad that he found the first mentions, the first real articulated explanation of what happens to a human being once death has taken place. And I took the trouble to study up on this to some degree. I can't read Sanskrit, so I didn't bother to dig out the ancient Vedas or anything like that. Certainly read quite a few Upanishads. Any of you familiar with the most famous of which is the Bhagavad Gita, of course. The Bhagavad Gita Upanishad is actually an Upanishad too, one of the more genuine ones. Now he discovered in the oldest of the Upanishads, which is called the Baharanarayaka Upanishad, which makes it the oldest because the set of books that preceded the Upanishads were called Aranarayaka. And because there's a mixture of the two titles, Baharanarayaka indicates that this Upanishad is the oldest of them all. And it was in that he found the first mention of the process of reincarnation. And it occurs in a conversation between two people. One of them is called Yajnavalkya, who was very famous in Sanskrit literature. The other one was a man called Arthabhaga. Both of these were yogis, they were practitioners. Yajnavalkya was very famous. He was considered to be, in the Hindu sense anyway, an enlightened being. Although at that time there were no Hindus, they had a different name. And because he was enlightened, then people liked to seek him out to try and get the answer to knotty questions. And so Arthabhaga sought him out at the court of one of the kings of northern India and asked him a series of questions, amongst which was what, the way he put it, was what happens to a man after death. There was a preamble where Arthabhaga explained the normal understanding of what becomes of the various parts of a human being when death takes place, where the body goes, where the fluids of the body go, where the mental parts, the feelings, perceptions, and all that kind of thing, what happens to them, and explains how it all goes back to the different elements of nature. And once he's finished this little dissertation, he then says, Yajnavalkya, can you tell me, where is that man then? Doesn't say woman, of course, because women didn't count in ancient India at all. They just out in the kitchen and rattle those pots and pans, as the usual approach. And Yajnavalkya won't tell him. But it's not that he won't tell him. He doesn't want to tell him right away because they're in a crowd of people. They're in this king's court. And there's lots of people listening and eavesdropping. And he says, well, I'll tell you, but not here. You must come with me because only I have this knowledge. And it's not for everybody. But as you seem to be the right kind of man, I'm willing to share it with you. Then you'll be the second person to know this great secret. And they go off someplace. And then Yajnavalkya explains to Arthabhaga that it's what you do in this life causes you to transmigrate or carry on, influences the way your next life will be. And it explains the law of karman, which is the same thing as the law of karma. It's just an ancient spelling. And that's the first articulated explanation, the first real mention of the basic the theory of reincarnation or rebirth, which has come to be accepted as an ultimate reality of life by most people who profess Buddhism in Thailand anyway. Now the problem with it, of course, is that it requires something to transmigrate, which means a human being, there has to be some component in here. Now unless we want to get supernatural and start talking about things that we can't experience, like souls and spirits, then we have a problem. What part of me then is this mysterious thing that somehow goes into another life? It's difficult to get around that, but there have been attempts to do it, although you need to really alter the way you think about yourself to understand it. You need to drop the idea of being in any way a being. The body doesn't matter from this. In this understanding, what we'll be talking about will be the mind, the mental part. And in this understanding, you need to think of yourself as a flow of experience, like a stream of consciousness, if you like. Something flowing on through time. This is what experience is. Okay, the physical body is necessary because it has the sense doors. And this allows information to go into this stream of consciousness that we normally refer to as the mind. Now this stream of consciousness is continually being changed by its experiences, of course, and although we say that you may not like to say this about yourself, but I'll say it about myself, we're ignorant, then it's not me that's ignorant, it's a stream of consciousness that's ignorant. So you have to kind of drop the idea that you are anything at all mentally, And you're really just a stream of events being continually changed by the things that you experience through your senses. Now, as long as we're ignorant, we're going to desire stimulation. But it won't be me that desires it, it will be this stream of consciousness that I think is me. So the idea is that as death approaches, as the physical body begins to break up, then this stream of consciousness, of course, is going to have to find a new home to depend on, a new physical platform, or body, if you like, to depend on. Now the idea is that what we've been doing during the course of this life and previous lives has created certain subconscious traits. We mentioned them with the baby, but we started from this life. We didn't bother to talk about any previous existence. But now we are. Doesn't mean I believe in such things, it's just that I'm explaining the process of reincarnation or rebirth from the normal understanding, from a physical point of view, and trying to fit it into a teaching which seems to deny any such possibility. So if you still desire, then at the moment of death your body might cease, and your mind will certainly become much more basic in the way it functions. And what will happen is your subconscious will take over. Now, subconscious will be dominated by the defilements, which are what keep us desiring stimulation, etc., etc. So all that will happen is that will simply guide you in a different direction. It will guide what you think is you in a different direction. And that stream of consciousness will then find a new physical platform to depend on. In other words, it will be born into it will begin to, well, it will originate as an egg in a womb somewhere, and will develop in a certain way, in dependence on what we've been doing in this life and previous lives. That's the idea. I don't know how clear that is, because if you've never heard this before, it must sound a bit strange. And we're all quite young here, well, except for me. I can't help that. So probably maybe not too closed up about things like rebirth or reincarnation. I talked about this once in Khandhas, northern Malaysia, to a very educated audience, but mostly old people, Chinese people. A lot of them were English educated, some were lawyers, barristers, things of that nature, mostly professional people. They're surprisingly closed up about things like rebirth, which I was foolish enough to deny the reality of completely. And at the end of the talk, they all asked me the same question. How do you know there's no such thing as rebirth? Well, how do you know there is such a thing as rebirth? Because I didn't really have a concrete answer. Now, they never asked me to give another talk, so I guess they weren't very happy with me. And the question I was asked finally was, how long have you been a monk? Well, at that time, only 6 years, so 6 years. Now they wouldn't be so happy, you know. Now, the idea is this is how it works, but the problem is, how do you go from one life to another? Now, there is an explanation of that, put together by a German gentleman, a monk, one of the first Westerners to ordain in Sri Lanka, who did this at the very early years of the 20th century. His name was Jnana Tiloka. His German name was Helmut Gore. A very erudite gentleman, very wise, very clever, who insisted always that the Buddha was teaching rebirth, but recognized the problems associated with it. So did his best to make it clear how rebirth happens, yes, the way I've just mentioned, but also how the consciousness makes its way, or whatever it is that transmigrates, makes its way from one physical life to another one. Now, it's in dependence on what we've been doing, and the way he described it is this. As death approaches, the body shuts down, first of all. The mind ceases to function in the normal conscious level, and the subconscious urges or habit patterns take over. That's reasonable. He says what they do is they manifest in the subconscious as a kind of desire to go on functioning in the same way we've always gone on functioning. The body's disappeared, so we have to start thinking in a slightly different way. And what it is, it's like a radio or radio transmitter emitting waves. Only they're karmic waves, waves of karmic energy. And what they're transmitting is the defilements, basically. They're transmitting out into the atmosphere in all directions. Now, somewhere in this world, in this country, maybe close by, maybe on another planet, I don't know how it's supposed to work in that way, there is something like a radio receiver which is tuned precisely to the wavelength that's being transmitted from the dying person. Now, it's not a radio transmitter, and we're not emitting radio waves, we're emitting karmic waves, but they're like radio waves in this explanation. So these radio waves are going everywhere, but there's one receiver, like a radio receiver somewhere, or one human being who's tuned precisely to that wavelength. And the thing, it's not the human being, but the womb of the human being and the egg in the human being, which is about to be fertilized by the sperm. So it's the climax of sexual intercourse. This is good stuff. And what happens is that these waves of karmic energy, they're emanating on a certain wavelength, and the radio receiver that receives them is the egg in the womb of a lady somewhere, just at the moment of the final moment of coition. And what happens is this, because that particular womb is conducive, is tuned to the right frequency, then the radio waves or the karmic waves emanating from you as you approach death are going to gravitate towards that particular destination. So whatever that is, might be animals, might be human beings again, copulating, having a great time, just reach the interesting bit, and at that moment this consciousness or whatever it is will enter the egg in the womb as it's fertilized, and this, they say, is what really vivifies the egg and starts it dividing, starts life going. And then you will be born, you will enter a womb, that's the idea, and you will be reborn in some form or another. Pretty weird stuff. So there you are, the Buddhists are damn clever, they know everything. Now nobody knows when this happens, of course, because there's no way we can know. People claim to remember previous lives, but they always seem to be rather doubtful individuals in the sense that, I mean, Buddhists say previous lives can be recollected, but we need to be careful how we understand that. This particular form of rebirth I'm describing is by far the most popular, and probably 99.99% of Buddhists believe in it, even Westerners, highly educated people, which doesn't really mean a lot when you come on to this level of understanding, of course. Because it's what we want to hear primarily. If nobody wants to die, death is the great fear. We want to be happy. You're not going to be very happy if you're thinking about death all the time. So you're not going to die, this is the idea. Well, this is actually true in the ultimate sense. You never will. Of course, it won't be you, because it's not you that's here now. The consciousness will never cease, because it's just reality. It's basic function of reality. It's everywhere in all things. We all share the same consciousness. It's just that we believe it's our consciousness. We make it me, and therefore separate ourselves from nature by doing that. The point is, you can't prove it, but the Buddhists say you can recollect previous lives, but there's quite a lot of rigmarole you need to go through to do that. You need to be a successful meditator, you need to receive insight to the point where you can weaken sufficiently ignorance and the feeling of being me. You need to understand this, how it works. You need to see it clearly, that what is here. You need to see it on some level, that what is here is not you, enough to convince you that the truth of yourself is that you are a process of nature, essentially. And the mind clears up to that degree. It becomes pure, it becomes elevated to a certain degree. Ignorance or delusion is lessened. It's called stream entry or sotapanna. Anybody who reaches this, they're not perfected human beings. They still have desires, dislikes, likes and dislikes. But they are able to control, and they feel less inclined towards the world. They're not under the spell of the consumer system, shall we say, to the normal extent. They can resist the siren call of stimulation to a large extent. These kind of people have the ability to recollect previous lives, not in all cases, in some certainly. But you see, they have practiced or restrained themselves considerably to be able to reach that kind of knowledge. Now, the only people I hear or read about remembering previous lives don't seem to have done anything much. And sometimes the children who practice nothing at all. Now, they're not small enough to be pure. A baby is probably pure mentally. But children even beyond the age of 4 or 5 would be defiled enough to have a very busy and unstill mind. Now, a stream enterer, somebody who approaches stream entry, has a mind which is mostly quiet. It's peaceful enough to be able to function in such a way, to be clear enough so that previous existences can be experienced. But the examples that I am confronted with never seem to be of that kind. Mostly they're very ordinary people who've just lived a very ordinary kind of life with the same basic superstitious beliefs that most of us have. So I'm always a bit doubtful about the memories when they talk about remembering previous lives, particularly Tibetans who are always flogging this business. Besides, nobody ever remembers hell. There are realms you get born into. The human realm, okay, you get born into that, but not always. The animal realm, short-lived. How about hell? That's for an eternity. That's a long time. We'll deny eternity because Buddhists don't believe in such things. Everything comes to an end. But hell is a long-lasting experience, and it's truly horrendous. It's like being in Manchester or somewhere your entire life. You're going to remember that, surely. But nobody ever does. They remember a life in a Sri Lankan village, which was, went to the toilet every day and ate my rice and curry and tilled the fields and beat the wife up when I got drunk. They remember that. Nobody remembers being in hell. And what about heavens? What about the 31 bhumis? I mean, there are various heavenly states you can be reborn into, and these are very long-lasting. You have all the chords of sense pleasure, everything's wonderful. For thousands of years. Nobody ever remembers those either. Strange. Maybe not today, I doubt we have time. How much time? Right. Must be cheese sandwich time. Time to finish in 5 minutes. You can talk or take questions for longer if you like. Right. What was I talking about?
Cheese sandwiches,
Cheese sandwiches, right, yes.